Okay, good morning, everyone. We're here today, slightly different venue, but and a slightly different idea. We get together often on these mornings of the legal holidays to talk about matters of significance, of import, and today, Mir Hashem, we're going to try to do the same. Sometimes we are talking directly about very relevant current issues in the framework of that issue. Today what I would like to do is speak about something which is very much relevant, a relevant current issue, but not as much speak of it in the framework of the issue, but speak of it in the context of trying to learn a lesson from history, to learn a story of the not so distant past, and the attitudes and the actions which were taken then, and to perhaps plant them in ourselves, in our consciousness, as something that could chart a course for us. I'm not sure if what we're going to speak about is completely in the hands of each and every one of us, but it's just perhaps a mindset and something which is worthy of consideration, to add a little bit of light to some tense and difficult issues and discussions. The story I want to tell you is a story which is seasonal, in the sense that the story occurred, the particular episode around which a lot of our discussion will revolve is a story which occurred exactly 106 years ago. Exactly meaning in this period of time. It's a story which started on Motzoi Shabbos Parshas Chayei Sarah, or Sunday of Parshas Toldos, which would be this week as Parshas Toldos, in the year 1913. Tuf Reish Ayin Dalid, because it was already after Rosh Hashanah. Tuf Reish Ayin Dalid. We call this a story of a journey to change history. It's a journey which was intended to change history, but which didn't. It failed to change history. Its intentions did not accomplish, its intentions were not fully accomplished. And I'd like to start to frame the story by reading you a little snippet from the Hamodia. The Hamodia, that's the forerunner of the Hamodia that some of you may get and read. This one had actually not a single advertisement for a Pesach hotel. This is the Hamodia from Cheshvan of 1913, and they have community notes. Divrei Seifrim, the words of scribes, and it has bylines from different places. Instead of Flatbush, Lakewood, and Cleveland, and Baltimore, you have Kovna, Yerushalayim, Vilna, Kishinev, Mezrich, and the following comes under the byline of Yerushalayim, under a report, a short, brief report from Yerushalayim. Osos Yedidios Hechelu Lehisros Bein Hayishuv Hayashon LaYishuv HaChadash. Signs of friendship have begun to appear between the old Yishuv, the old settlement, and the new one. Asher mehem tikvais teves nishkafais be'ezas Hashem al shmei Hayishuv HaKadosh be'eretz HaKodesh. That from these signs of friendship, there are great hopes to be anticipated, with God's help, to appear on the skies, on the horizon of the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. What is he describing? The Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael, Balei Hayoshon, the people from the old classic Yishuv, the old classic settlement in Yerushalayim, are making a trip to the settlements with the permission and the agreement, the invitation of the heads of the settlements, for the purpose of strengthening Bidkei Hados, strengthening religious function and structure within those settlements. The organizer and initiator of this trip is Rabbi Ben Zion Yadler. Rabbi Ben Zion Yadler was from a significant Yerushalmi family. He was one of the Magidim, one of the preachers of Yerushalayim, but he had a specific task, he had a specific tafkid, and that was that he was the mashgiach for the special halachas of kashrus that apply in Eretz Yisrael. Now, you all know that you can walk into any supermarket any place in Baltimore, and you don't even have to go scanning for a little, letter in a circle or a letter in a star. Just go to the fruit and vegetables the side and, get yourself an apple, get yourself an orange, get yourself a banana, a cucumber, a tomato. You'll be okay. In Eretz Yisrael, life is, Baruch Hashem, in this way more complex. You have a chance to do many, many mitzvahs, and also not to do many, many mitzvahs with just simple produce. Produce also needs certification, because in Eretz Yisrael we have the mitzvahs hatliyos ba'aretz, the agricultural mitzvahs. We have to tithe fruits before we eat them. We have to be more certain of the status of the fruits, that they are free of the concerns of arla, of being grown from the first 3 years of the tree's life. We have to worry about shmita and all of the consequences of that. So there are many additional considerations. And we have to understand that at this period of time, there was a little bit of a mutual need that existed between the old and the new. We'll understand that the settlement, the agricultural settlement of Eretz Yisrael, which had started already in the 1800s, in the later part of the 1800s, was just trying to get going. And as it was producing things, the natural market for any produce is local. Nowadays we ship things all over the world, and so if you're a yuppie, you buy local. But once upon a time, you just plain bought local. And these moshavot, these settlements, were developing agricultural produce, and they wanted to sell it. And where would they want to sell it? They would want to sell it locally. And the market that perhaps might be closed to them would be their fellow Jews, if there wasn't clarity about the mitzvahs hatliyos ba'aretz, that the Torah mitzvahs were fulfilled. So Rabbi Zion Yadler was appointed by the Rabbonim of Yerushalayim, by the rabbis of Yerushalayim, as well as by Rav Kook, who was the Rav of Yafo and the settlements, as he was known, to be someone who would travel around and help make sure that the produce from these developing settlements would be properly tended to halachically, that the proper tithes would be separated, and so on. And so it would be able to be used by the market in the communities of the faithful. So he traveled around, and he went to these places, to these points of settlement. And what he discovered in these points of settlement was very disturbing. You have to understand that at this point in time, how many Jews were there in Eretz Yisrael? There were about 85,000 Jews in Eretz Yisrael. About 85,000 Jews. It's a remarkable thing when we consider what has happened in the span of a century. But there were 85,000 Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And of those 85,000 Jews, I believe it was about 12,000 Jews who were scattered in some 40-something small settlements, some of them more in the area of Yehuda, of Judea, many in the Galil, many further north. And these communities were tiny, tiny communities that, again, some of them a little bit bigger, some of them smaller, some of them could be called villages. Many of them were just small outposts with maybe dozens of families. And, they were not able to listen to a lot of shiurim online. They were completely isolated. They were struggling for their very existence. And they had lost contact with the yishuv. In the best cases, they were isolated and didn't have it. Today, a Chabad shliach in Tanzania is able to have his children going to school on this, online academy. We have so many ways of connecting. You want a Jewish book and you live someplace, so Amazon will have it at your door in a minute. None of this was possible. To try to imagine the isolation of small communities with children without the ability to have schooling and so on and so forth, it was very remote and very, very distant.
Are these only religious settlements you're talking about?
No. These were all of the settlements. And there were some which were better and some which were farther away. The ones which were better had a combination of two things, or could have a combination of two things. Some of them were geographically closer to Yerushalayim, and they were more within reach. And so there would be more, what we call shayoras mitzuyas, there would be more traffic between the yishuv, and they would see each other more, and there were more possibilities of interaction, and some of them were far away, they were more remote. Some of them were yishuvim which were founded by the members and children of the members of the earlier settlements who themselves were observant Jews, and some of them were founded by, or heavily staffed and populated by people who came at a later time, who came not for what we would conventionally call religious reasons, and not with what we would conventionally call religious attitudes and practices. And this was all in the mix. It was all in the mix. It was all in the mix, and it created a whole society that was very, very, very different than the Yishuv Hayashan and the old Yishuv, which was comprised and maintained itself to a certain degree with people who had come to Eretz Yisrael with only spiritual aspirations. They came to be the group that would be representing Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, in Torah, in prayer, in living with the simplest of lives. That was plan A. That was, in a great sense, the way many came. Of course, yes, there were people who came with messianic ideals and so on and so forth, but the classic tipus, the classic image of the Yishuv HaYoshan were people who were there, living simply for the sake of God, Torah, and so on. And then you had these communities that had grown out to these places. And there, the connection to religion was weak. And sometimes not just weak, but even hostile. So into this, we have the agricultural enterprise, and it will benefit everybody to be able to have that agricultural enterprise usable by everybody. Rav Yadler goes around to try to see what can be done, and while there are things that can be done, perhaps to make a remedy for trumos and maestros and so on and so forth, but he sees a bigger picture, and the bigger picture is the general failure of Judaism in these outlying communities, in these small developing communities. It was not just him. Of course, as we will see, there were others, but he certainly gets a tremendous amount of credit for this putting together this particular journey, which is described in this article. And that is that he got together, or it was gotten together, the Rav Kook, who was the rabbi of Yafo and the settlements, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who was the Rav of the Yishuv Hayoshan, what we call today the Eda HaCharedis. What we call today the Eda HaCharedis, which is the very, very strong and traditional and non-Zionist community that's there in Yerushalayim, and along with several other Rabbanim, and they decided together to go on a journey, on a mission, on a tour of the Moshavot. It was not going to be in an air-conditioned bus. It was going to be in a rickety wagon, sometimes riding on a donkey, many times walking through mud and rain. They wanted to do it as early as possible because, the rainy season comes shortly in Eretz Yisrael. And the journey started out, basically, Rav Yosef Chaim left Yerushalayim on Sunday of Parshas Toldos. This is the report, this is the story here. And it was a journey which lasted for more than a month. And they traveled and went to dozens of such yishuvim. They visited them, they were invited, welcomed by and large. The visits were not completely without tension and difficulty. Many times there were tensions, many times there were people who stood up in protest, but by and large, it was a very wonderful journey, and something which everyone, not everyone again, but I would say rather almost everyone, came away from, both on the rabbinic side and on the other side, feeling a tremendous thing had been accomplished, that some closeness had been achieved between the two sides. That's the snapshot of the story. I want to try to fill in the story a little bit so we can learn a little bit about what it means when you talk about Klal Yisrael, what it means when you talk about alienation of one group from another, the potential of bringing people together, what great people truly, in a great sense, hoped for and yearned for. We'll start with a little snippet of an incident that I've shared with some of you not so long ago, and I'll just share it very briefly as something which can help set a little bit of the context for this story. You see, Rav Kook came to Eretz Yisrael in 1904. He was brought to Eretz Yisrael to be the Rav of Yafo. Yafo, today Tel Aviv Yafo. Yafo was a city which was an Arab Jewish city. Tel Aviv was built as a Jewish city, but Yafo was far, relatively speaking, to some degree from Yerushalayim, and it was a community that stood, so to speak, as a community of the new yishuv, of the new settlement, as opposed to the old. We've already described briefly, and you're familiar, that there was the old, very, very traditional, and as time went on, especially with the second Aliyah, where many Jews were running away from the difficulties of Europe, from the difficulties, the pogroms of Russia, and the poverty and everything else, there was a new Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, which was not an Aliyah of people that were steeped in or that were engaged in matters of tradition. Yerushalayim had the great rabbinic figures, Rav Shmuel Salant, Rav Eliyahu David Rabinovitz Te'umim, who was known as the Aderes, who was actually the father-in-law of Rav Kook, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rav Kook was brought to be the rabbi of the new Yishuv, of Yafo, of the Moshavot, ultimately became Yafo v'ha-Moshavot, and all these points of settlement, that he would be able to go out there to be able to connect to them. His job wasn't to tend to the traditional strong Jews. His job was to nurture tradition in a different type, in a different generation, in a different segment of Klal Yisrael. We told the story some time ago that just a couple of months after Rav Kook arrived in Eretz Yisrael, Theodor Herzl died. Suddenly, Theodor Herzl died. And Herzl was a heroic figure to huge numbers of Jews. He captivated the imagination of thousands. And it wasn't just thousands of secular Jews, though Herzl himself stood certainly as he originally embarked on this journey as a very, very secular Jew. He captured the imagination of many. We talked about it at other times, the remarkable array of people who spoke about him. But he also, besides capturing the imagination of many, he also captured the opposition of many, because here he was coming as a secular Jew, advancing an image for a state which would have a very severe and clear separation between shul and state. And not everybody felt that a person with such background and with such goals should be leading the charge. They had questions whether a charge of this kind should be led at all. This was taking a more strident position of asking for a state, whereas many people from the old Yishuv preferred to lie low under the radar and to just have a more organic development of a Jewish community that was able to live under whatever the local governing authority was. Complicated matters. Rav Kook comes to Eretz Yisrael. A couple months later, Herzl dies, and Rav Kook is approached by leaders in his community and saying, we're going to be making a memorial gathering for Herzl. We would like you to speak and to address the memorial gathering. And Rav Kook we would reference again the other discussion. Rav Kook had himself very, very conflicted feelings. Very conflicted feelings. He had certain strong oppositions to Herzl because of this religious secular thing, but he agreed. And the eulogy which he gave, which has been printed many, many times, it's called Hamispeid B'Yerushalayim, the eulogy in Jerusalem, even though it was not given in Yerushalayim. It's actually taken from a phrase, a biblical phrase, which the Gemara discusses. Was an essay which was printed over and over again. It's a classic essay of Rav Kook, given on the passing of Herzl. In the essay, at least the printed essay, his name is not mentioned a single time. He speaks more about a concept. And the concept which he speaks about is very central to this discussion. And the concept which he spoke about was that in Jewish life, we have had two leaders, and we will ultimately have two leaders. We have a tradition that there are two Mashiachim, two Messiahs, the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David. The Mashiach descending of Yosef and the Mashiach descending of David. The Mashiach ben Yosef, like Yosef, was a king of the Jews. The Mashiach ben David, like David, was a king of the Jews. The Mashiach ben Yosef, like Yosef, who became a king, we wouldn't usually see him as a king in the spiritual realm. Yosef was the king of Egypt, who managed the agricultural treasure of Egypt at a time of great difficulty for the world and potentially for Egypt. He was the Mashbir l'chol am haaretz. He fed and sustained the world. His role as a king, at least visibly, was physical. To be able to take care that the Jewish people could be physically sustained. It's not the whole story, of course, we understand. We understand that Yosef constantly invoked HaKadosh Baruch Hu in every success which he had. We understand, Chazal even tell us that Yosef wanted to give a bris milah to all of the Egyptians. He had, of course, an agenda of spirituality, but the open and visible portfolio of Yosef as a leader was as the person who would sustain physically the country which he governed and his brethren. Then we have another tipus, another leader, and that is Yehuda. Yehuda is the other melech, the great-grandfather of David HaMelech. Yehuda comes and meets up with and confronts Yosef, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. But more than that, we find, in Rav Kook's words, Haisa Yehuda L'Kotshai, Yehuda was for his Holy One, for his holiness. And the hint to it we have, of course, is that when Yaakov Avinu sent Yehuda ahead of the rest, it was Lahoros Lefanav, which Chazal say, to establish a yeshiva, to establish a Beis Horah, a Beis Talmud, to establish an educational infrastructure for the people. And so, said Rav Kook, there are these two pieces. There's the physical building of the Jewish people and the spiritual building of the Jewish people. And ultimately, these two should come together. They should work in significant partnership with the spiritual, of course, standing at the head, because the purpose of the Jewish people is not material. The mission of the Jewish people is not material. The mission of the Jewish people is the spiritual. However, said Rav Kook, we have a long history, a history which includes the story of the split of the kingdom into two, this history that includes the tension between Yosef and his brothers, where those who tend to the physical well-being of the Jewish people and those who tend to the spiritual well-being of the Jewish people, they don't have synergy. They don't always see each other as valued partners. The physical doesn't appreciate the spiritual, and the spiritual doesn't appreciate the physical. And we need, said Rav Kook, his message fundamentally was that we need to remedy this, especially at this time where we have a whole movement of people who are there to restore the Jewish people as a physical presence, to build up the physical land of Israel, and they're motivated to do this in the most significant way. And we have in Eretz Yisrael the holiest of people who have dedicated themselves completely to Torah and to the world of the Spirit. And these two camps need to see themselves as partners. And then the Jewish people will be able to get someplace. Then the physical will have the spirit, and the spirit will have the body that will enable it to function. That was basically Rav Kook's call, and he turned and he said, you, builders of the physical Eretz Yisrael, need to recognize and to welcome the spiritual mission, which is the mission of our people. Now, in 1913, there was no Fox News. In 1913, there was no CNN. But in 1913, there were already sound bites. And the sound bite which came back from Rav Kook's speech was, you guessed it, Rav Kook called Herzl Mashiach. Rav Kook eulogized Herzl, and he said he was the Mashiach, Mashiach ben Yosef. So Rav Kook hadn't quite said that. He spoke about streams and movements within the people. He spoke about a need to rebuild the land, and he gave credit to the rebuilders of the land as doing a function within the world of the Mashiach ben Yosef. But more than anything else, his was a call for, again, those focused on the material well-being of the Jewish people to recognize the importance of the spirit, and vice versa. But he was addressing those who were speaking of the physical. Rav Kook got a letter from his father-in-law, the Aderes, Rabbi David Rabinovitz Tu'umim, who had been brought to Eretz Yisrael to be the heir apparent and in the interim the assistant rabbi of Rav Shmuel Salant, who was like 100 years old, a very old man. And they brought in somebody to be his eventual successor. Irony of ironies, the Aderes lived for 2 years in Eretz Yisrael and then he died. He died before Rav Shmuel Salant. But the Aderes was there, and his position was challenged because in Yerushalayim itself there were those who valued the partnership and those who valued it less, who were opposed to it. Rav Shmuel Salant himself sent a telegram of condolence to the widow of Herzl with appreciation and respect. The Aderes, his assistant rabbi, didn't sign the telegram because it was also the case that Rav Shmuel Salant wanted a eulogy to be said for him, a memorial gathering for Herzl in the Churva synagogue. And there was a great groundswell amongst Kanoim, amongst people who were a little bit tougher in the community, and they basically made it that it couldn't happen. And the Aderes didn't want to get himself into the middle of this. And the next thing you know, word comes that his son-in-law is busy calling Herzl Mashiach in his position, in his Steller down the road in Yafo. So he was a little concerned. And Rav Kook wrote him back a letter. And Rav Kook wrote and he said, my task, my role in this community, in this world, is to try to bring some level of connection for the kavod of Hashem Yisbarach, for the honor of Hashem Yisbarach, and the honor of His Torah amongst the broader community. And he says, and my position has always been, and it's a published position, said Rav Kook, how we are supposed to proceed when we want to make claims or quote-unquote demands for the need of the time, for the honor of Hashem and for the honor of the Torah. Lo b'tzakos u'merivos, v'lo b'harchokos muflogos l'chol mi shenimtza olav shem etzdofi. Not with cries and not with arguments and not with distancing those who have in them a trace of some kind of failure. But rather with words of favor and proper wisdom, with ropes of love and connections to people to draw them close. To draw them close. So he says, I came here. I'm fresh off the boat. They said they're making such a gathering, and they did it for him, and they understand that even people who oppose Zionism understand that he meant well. So he didn't find the right path, Herzl writes Rav Kook. But nevertheless, you can't ignore something good which he did. It would be completely inappropriate not to do something public for him. And they did it in the Bank, yes, of England and Palestine, which was there. So I promised them that I would come, and that I would speak, and I would do it in a way that people would not be able to be there and use the opportunity to rail against the Torah community, but quite the opposite. And he says, and I spoke pleasantly and properly to them, and I revealed to them that the foundation of that which would be the source of failure for their enterprise would be the lack of recognition of the importance of Jewish destiny in their life. So he goes on to speak about this, and he says that you have to understand that this is the way I have to do things. And I cannot go and take a strident position just because people on another side will misunderstand me, or it will look bad, or will reflect poorly. I have to do the real work. I'm not going to be, cowed from doing the real work by people who will misunderstand and misportray. I have to do the real work of trying to help those people who we are depending on in terms of how they are developing Admas Kodshenu, and to do it in a way where I can't box myself into a spot where any guidance, any input, any conversation which I would want to have in the future would fall on deaf ears. We have to do something with relationships of respect and recognition to be able to come together. So this was Rav Kook. Unbowed. This is what he was going to do. This is how he responded. And he continued in this sense with this hope. This is when he's right off the boat. This continues to be his position. And very interestingly, just a little while later, in an exchange, in a letter which his father-in-law wrote to him about the matter of Trumos u'Maisros, the tithes and things to take care of in these settlements, he writes as follows: I've received many letters from the God-fearing members of those colonies, of those settlements, asking me to take an active role to make sure that the mitzvos of Eretz Yisrael are being done. But he says, this failing, that in many communities the leadership went far away, he says the blame lies to some degree in the hands of the then rabbis of Yerushalayim. They allowed a distance to grow between them, and they paid no attention to them. They didn't visit them. He says, that's not been my position since I arrived here. I've always yearned to go and to see them. I love to go and to see them. And I often have recalled the frightening statement which is found in Tana de Be'elio, Perek Yud Aleph. And over there it tells the story that the members at a certain point, a certain juncture of failure in the Jewish people, that blame lay with the members of the Sanhedrin that should have hitched themselves up to the wagons to travel throughout Eretz Yisrael to bring Torah and connection there. Rav Kook himself wrote already, again, 1910, years before this actual trip. He writes, Echad me'atikunim hayoser gedolim, this is in one of the letters of Rav Kook, one of the great things that we would be able to do that would be the greatest remedy for the spiritual situation in Eretz Yisrael by strengthening the Jews of these settlements would be Sheyeh anoichi ba'ani misaviv miperek leperek b'mayshavos. I should make regular trips, a circuit, traveling these settlements to see generally Jewish matters, how they are being conducted, v'lidrosh divrei tochacha u'musar haskel, and to speak to them, He says divrei tochacha, words of rebuke and wise instruction, in Rav Kook's manner. Avol tzorich lezeh itzah chashuva, and he says, but it will require, there are expenses that are involved in doing so, in being able to have those travels and to be able to go around. I'll need to have a chariot, a wagon that's going to be there at my disposal to be able to take me on these journeys. At that time, he writes about some 30 settlements that he would like to visit. Nobody pays attention to them. I am keenly aware of the extent of the influence of these kinds of trips, these kinds of visits, when there is a proper conversation and a chance to teach, and all manners of bringing close, of forging relationship. But again, it requires some expense. Rav Kook is writing this letter about a number of items on, so to speak, a shopping list for the Jewish people there in Eretz Yisrael. But he says, we will see, this should give us a chance to connect the new Yishuv with the old to the love of God and to the observance of Torah. This was his call, this was his idea, and it only comes to pass, again, years later, and again, he writes in a different letter, in hope and anticipation, about what's going to come to pass. So they went. Now, that Rav Kook went doesn't serve as a big surprise to anybody. That was his job. That Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld went surprises people a little bit more. But Rav Yosef Chaim himself, it is known to those who study a little bit more closely, Rav Yosef Chaim himself was someone who was thrilled by the development of the Yishuv as it was happening outside of Yerushalayim. Yes, there were those amongst the old Yishuv who were only concerned with the building of the spiritual kernel in Yerushalayim. Rav Yosef Chaim took great delight in the development of Yishuvim beyond, with great concern about their distance from the world of the Spirit, but at the same time with great hope. He writes, Ha'im yitochen lo liros es yad ha'ashgacha al yaina b'chol zeh. Is it possible to not see the hands of divine providence in all of this? What's he referring to all of this? The Moshavos HaChadoshos, the new settlements, Shtochim Shashmova Ve'erikonios Sholtu Ben B'meshach Doreis Rabim, stretches of land of Eretz Yisrael where emptiness and desolation were the rule for generations. And now, Lofshu Chaim Upricha, they're now dressed with life and blossoming. Everywhere we see gardens and orchards, beautiful, green and blossoming. Ubevadai, right? We have to involve ourselves, he says, in the settlement of the land with a trust. Trust in Hashem who gave us His holy Torah. Ubevadai, and we can be certain, if we will be faithful to the Torah, we'll be able to live here securely for an extended period of time. Rav Yosef Chaim wrote at another time, and this was in 1929, during the very difficult times, around the riots of 1929. He says, during my time here in the Eretz HaKodesh, Hashem has stirred the spirit of some special people to fulfill the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael agriculturally, through tending to the land, to eat of its fruit and enjoy its goodness, to fulfill the mitzvahs hatluyas ba'aretz. And through them, there have been many settlements established throughout Yehuda, throughout Judea, throughout the Galilee, that I had afterwards the pleasure to travel them. And I made a bracha, Baruch Matziv Gevul Almon. It's a bracha a person's supposed to make when they come to see a place that had been desolate in Eretz Yisrael and now been restored. There's a bracha, Baruch Matziv Gevul Almona. And Rav Yosef Chaim, it was known, had a tremendous hope that the mitzvah of settling Eretz Yisrael that was being fulfilled and developing Eretz Yisrael that was being fulfilled by these who themselves were distant from doing it l'shem mitzvah, for the sake of a mitzvah, for the sake of Torah, but that mitzvah would ultimately stir more within them. So he was completely on board in joining in this mission. He was completely on board in joining together with Rav Kook and with others to go and to try to create this friendship, this connection between the two sides. And they went on this journey.
When was it?
This was 1913. At this time of year exactly in 1913. And they traveled together. And I want to just share with you, they themselves published a chronicle of the journey, which is available. You can find it. It's available, I think, on Hebrew books and other places, called Eile Maseh. These are the journeys, like the Parsha, which ends Sefer Bamidbar, which speaks about the travels of the Jewish people in the desert. They called it by that, and it's literally a log of their trip. I'm holding here a recently published modern version of it, which is complete with many, many beautiful pictures and many beautiful additions to the story. But they tell the story, they chronicle the trip from this place to that, how they were welcomed here, what they spoke about, what agreements were made about things that would be put into place in these communities for the future. And it's filled with it's fascinating. It's fascinating. You read about, they go to a place like Hadera, which have 35 families, which today has a 4-star hotel and beautiful neighborhoods. It's remarkable, the transformation. But in terms of the core issue, this was a trip in order to strengthen the Yiddishkeit in these communities. It wasn't just to see them. It was to create a bond, to create friendship, and to strengthen Yiddishkeit in these communities. And there are a couple of stories that I want to share from this journey that are instructive, and a little bit of the words of the Rabbanim themselves as a postscript to the journey, which are instructive. Here's one story.
There, according to my Google, 80,000 people.
80,000 people there. Okay, so more than 35 families. Okay. Bli ayin hara. It's an amazing thing what has happened, and we can never lose sight of it, and never lose sight of that gift that we have here, in this time. On the 25th of Cheshvan, this delegation came to a community called Merchavia. It's still there. You'll see it on the roadside. It's not a big city, but Merchavia, a yeshuv in Eretz Yisrael. And they came there, and it's in the north, it's in the Galilee. And the Rav of Tiberia, Rav Moshe Kliers, came to join them there. But he came with some very sad news. And the sad news was that in the past day or two young men, members of the Yishuv, people involved in settlement, had been murdered by Arabs. They had been murdered by Arabs. One of them's name was Moshe Barsky. And Moshe Barsky, for instance, just interesting, was killed as he rode by horse from his community to Tiberia in order to get a midwife to come back to help a woman give birth. And he was murdered on the way. And the woman, Baruch Hashem, gave birth successfully and named the child after Moshe Barsky. The family name was Dayan. That was Moshe Dayan. So that was the story that surrounded his birth. The Rabbanim, the community, heard about the death of these two, which is a huge thing. And Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was the one to get up first to be maspid, to eulogize. And he was eulogizing not young men who were outstandingly religious in their observance. They were members of the Yishuv HaChadash, settling the land, not particularly strong in the realm of tradition. When Rav Yosef Chaim gave a hesped, he gave a eulogy, speaking about the magnificence of their enterprise, of what they had done, of what they had given their life for. And yes, of course, within the eulogy, he spoke about the introduction of faith into Jewish life, back into Jewish life, making it front and center. Rav Kook followed him and did the same. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld himself said a Kel Molei Rachmim, he said a memorial prayer for these two young men. He recognized the value, the significance of what they had done. And as he was there, and the distance between the people of these yeshuvim and this rabbi who was the symbol of the old yeshuv in Yerushalayim, it started a little bit to crumble. One of the very nice nispachim, one of the very nice appendices that is found in this modern version of the Eila Maseh is a little note which was found amongst the notes of Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap. Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap was a student peer of Rav Kook. He actually succeeded Rav Kook as the head of Merkaz Harav. And Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap was a big Talmud Chacham, and he wrote notes of a conversation that he had in Merchavia that night with one of the workers, one of the people who lived in Merchavia. And they were talking about the relationship between the traditional community and this new, non-traditional settlement community. And the guard with whom he was talking said, look, you know, we don't want to be distant from faith per se, but we realize that we're isolated from the community, so necessarily we're separated from the faith. So he says, what do you mean? He says, well, we have one overarching principle that guides us in our work here of settlement. And what's that? Avodah Yehudit. Everything they did only through Jewish hands. There are still some people in Eretz Yisrael who have that principle. Most do not. You know, you'll see Arab and Palestinian workers almost everywhere. But there are some who, in principle, and this dates back to then, whether it was because of fear or because of pride, they believed in Avodah Yehudit, only Jewish workers. So we have only Jewish workers, and there's work that has to be done on Shabbos, and since that's our biggest principle, so therefore we had to desecrate the Shabbos. And we understand, he says, that if we have to do this, if we have to carry our weapons on Shabbos, and we have to milk our cows on Shabbos, and we know that this is forbidden by Jewish law, and in our principles, we're not going to bring a non-Jew into our community to do this work for us, so we have no choice but to break the Jewish law. And therefore we recognize that we are isolated and separate from the rest of the Jewish community. And once we're isolated and separated from the Jewish community because we're Mechalei Shabbos, so then why should we bother with anything else? And everything else slipped away as well. That slipped away because of necessity. But once we feel far away, once we feel distant, so then why should we be involved in anything? Rav Charlap asked him, what about the things that the Jewish people believe in? You know, the beliefs, the opinions of the Jewish people. How do you feel about them? He says, the guard said, we believe the same as they do. We believe the same as they do. It's just that it's just that we feel distant because of all of this. And the way the conversation, of course, continues, is that, you know, here we're experiencing that you don't consider us so far away, that you're willing to still come close to us, that we have not become michutz lamachane because we've done these things. Now, what does that mean? Of course, they weren't telling him Chilul Shabbos was okay. What all of these people were speaking about the Moshe is to restore it. But they would still speak with them. They would still eulogize them as Kedoshim. They would still value them and have a connection to them, even if they weren't quite there yet. If only those bonds could exist. And they have specific conversation about the geographic distance and the possibilities if there would be a community of the faithful nearby that they would somehow be connected to, how it would allow them to still feel apart, how it would allow them to join and to continue. This was the conversation, and this was the bridge that they were trying to cross. To put it in more dramatic terms, I'll tell you another story that happened in a different place, that happened in Poria. Rav Kook got up to speak, and he spoke about how, again, the same theme we said before, how we both have to come together. The people who are building the land physically and the people who are building the land spiritually, we have to see ourselves as partners. We have to believe what each other believes. We have to value what each other values. And he says, before I continue, he asked to have a guard worker's uniform. And Rav Kook changed his clothes, and he got dressed in it. He put his shtreimel on one of and his rabbinic coat on one of the guards. He swapped clothes with him. And he said, we have to be each other. We have to connect to each other in this way. And they broke out into a big dance. There are testimonies of people who were there, who sighed, who remembered it, said like there was never such an experience that they had. כשם שאני לבשתי את שלכם ואתם את שלי באופן חיצוני כך צריך להיות גם בלב. And he said, the same way I dressed in your garments and you dressed in mine, superficially, it should be the same thing within the heart. They were trying to create this bond of connection and understanding between two sides. And in that way, hopefully, that the communities which were geographically remote would be able to come a little bit closer in the spiritual sense. Now, this is not to say that it was all sugar and spice. There were times when they took very, very strong positions. The most striking story is the story that happened in Zichron Yaakov, where in Zichron Yaakov they came to a community. It was a more established and built community. You could still visit and see old Zichron Yaakov today. It's beautiful, magnificent. But it was built, by the Rothschilds and by the Alliance, and it was built with a more modern flavor, like was there in terms of Judaism. And Rav Kook and Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who were going to be there for Shabbos, said that they couldn't daven in the shul. And they couldn't daven in the shul because the bima, where they read from the Torah, was not like you see it here, be'emtza, in the middle of the shul, but it was at the front. And that was one of the sort of signature changes which was made in Reformed synagogues, was to put the bima in the front and not in the middle, as it traditionally is in a shul. And they said, well, as long as it's there, we're not going to be able to daven in the shul. And there were all kinds of negotiations, but there were a couple of people, leaders of the community council, who just one especially, who stood their ground. It was humiliating because Friday night there were two people who came to the shul, and everybody else in the community went to daven with Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld in the small motel, whatever it was, in the small guest house where they were staying. And they stood their ground. They stood their ground. This was not just, anything goes, we're just going to be here to make friends. They felt that the ultimate goal here was, yes, to create friendship and to reestablish standards of what Jewish life is supposed to look like. And so it wasn't friendship that was just built on compromise. It was friendship which was built on recognizing the value that each party added. And the value that party added was their tremendous dedication to Eretz Yisrael, to the rebuilding of Eretz Yisrael, to the development of Eretz Yisrael. The value that they added wasn't in building their modern synagogue with the bima in a different place. That part they weren't going to respect. That part they weren't going to accept. It wasn't going to break down the conversation and say, well, because you have it there, we're not going to talk to you. We're not going to relate to you. We're not going to try to help you. No, because you have it there, we're not joining you there. We're not going to go into that synagogue. And I'm sorry if it offends you, but that's a realm which is not your expertise. That's a realm in which you are not contributing to the Holy Land. So they stood their ground. And at the same time, they were filled with friendship. They found the areas where what they were doing was so valuable, and they related to it, and they started, and they tried to build it up. When the journey finished, and we have to wind down this journey, when the journey finished, they published this book, Eila Maseh. And there was an introduction to the book Eila Maseh, which was a letter which was signed by all of the Rabbanim. It was written by Rav Kook, but they didn't forge Rav Yosef Chaim's signature on it. He actually signed on it. He joined, it was published from all of them. It's a beautiful letter, and when Rav Kook wrote it and he submitted it, and we have this in his own letters, he says, you want to make changes, you can make changes, but you can't change the tone. The tone of warmth and of friendship that is there in this letter, I insist upon, and that can't be changed. So let's look at it, just like a little interesting thing. It says, one of the visions of our time, and by the way, the version which I'm reading to you can be found in this book. It also can be found in Ha'ish al HaChoma, which is a biography of Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, which was translated into English as Guardian of Jerusalem. For some reason, this letter is not, even though it's found in this version, it's not found in the English translation. It's only just one paragraph of a multi-page letter is found in the English translation. One of the visions that marhive halev, that stir the heart in our generation, is the vision of the return to Eretz Yisrael, which is progressing on all fronts in these recent years. Those who are truly faithful in the Jewish people certainly need to rejoice over this incredible vision in which we see Aschalta de Geula, the beginning of our redemption. Like that's often considered to be like a very politically sensitive thing to say it's the beginning of our redemption. I mean, we certainly hope that Mashiach will build on what has been built in the past 70 years. And when we look at these developing settlements, on the cities that are growing, on the buildings that are being established, the neighborhoods that are being established in Eretz Yisrael, and we read the words of the Navi, so said Hashem Elokim, on the day that I purify you from all your sins, and I will make the cities settled, and the ruins will be rebuilt, and the desolate land will be worked in place of the desolation which it had before the eyes of all passers-by. This land will be like Gan Eden, and the desolate cities and the broken down walls will be again inhabited. We're like dreamers, Hayinu kechelmim. But they go on to write about the isolation from Yiddishkeit, which was present in this Yishuv. And they say that not a small portion of the blame lies with the Chelik HaTorani, with the fact that there has been a great distance that has been established between the Chelik HaTorani, the Torah community that dwells in the holy cities, from the Yishuv Hayashan, and how remote they have come, how far away they have grown from the desires and the designs of the Yishuv HaChadash. So, it says the Hashafifa Hanigudis Lumas Hagashmias Shematzala Bitzur B'Yishuv Hayashan Becheftzol Lisater B'Ktusha Atzilas Haruyol L'fi Hay Ktusha Samokaim L'fi Hagaguim Ha'elyonim Hatovsim B'Levis Kol Hara Be'enav Kol Sridei Chemodoseinu Mimei Kedem B'Churbanam. He says the tremendous desire to focus in only on the Spirit for those who have come and been able to be restored to these holiest of places, and the yearning for the restoration of all that was holy and sacred to us. This desire caused, in its purity, a distance, both in thought and in place, between brothers who really need Shiluv Yodayim, who need to join hands in every effort. And as such, the both sides have been weakened. The hashpah, the influence of the spiritual on the physical, materially building camp has dried up, and it is just drowning up to its neck in its secularity. The connection which should have been there is no longer there. So they write about what they accomplished in their mission. But the accomplishment was just really identifying issues. And this booklet, which was Eila Maseh, was published as a fundraiser. They had designs, ideas about taking people, families, educators, putting them in all of these moshavot, to create a proper religious educational infrastructure. In many of these places, their sponsors from Western Europe had created educational infrastructure which was very far from a religious education. And they wanted to do it, to build it up, to supply it. They wanted that these kinds of journeys of Rabbanim would be frequent. Going once will not do the trick, that they would be frequent. They said, we came late, but we didn't come too late. And so let's quickly go and let's be able to do more. And their final editorial comment on their trip goes as follows. Besides for some specific unusual details, all of the committees in the communities accepted what we asked of them. We've recorded many of these commitments in this booklet. Many things have been established. But beyond for what has been established, you can see from the language of the various commitments that, that there were those who were trying to undermine, and those who were trying to say, no, we won't be able to fulfill this or that. But one thing we can tell you, which is clear and certain to us, and that is in praise of all these settlements, that the inclination to faith and to observance in the heart of the Jew was always very obvious to us. And if not for the counterforce of some external stirrings, which came from yechidim, which came from individuals, if not for that, all of the things which we had written, all of the things that would have been proposed, would have been accepted willingly. But there were always some in the opposition that had to be negotiated around. And he says, and they write and they say, that when we give over these impressions that are upon us from this trip, we hope that these will speak for themselves to show how serious and how positive there is an opportunity for faithful Judaism in Eretz Yisrael. And so, to the Jews all over the world that yearn for Eretz Yisrael to be rebuilt in the spirit of Hashem, we turn for help so we can in fact infuse them with the breath of religious life. What else happened in 1914 besides the publication of this booklet? The First World War broke out. To put it mildly, it wasn't so good for Jewish fundraising. And so this plan, this idea, died. And whereas they wrote, we came late, but we didn't come too late, well, by the time the dust settled, it was getting later and later. It's still not too late, but it was getting later and later. Why do I share with you this story? I share with you this story because it was the kind of journey that would change history. They meant for it to change history. They understood that there were people on the extremes. There were people on the extremes, people in the religious community who were opposed to any physical settlement. They didn't want members of the Yishuv, religious people, to go into build physical structures to rebuild the land, even though they were impoverished to an extreme. Let's continue to live off of the gifts of others because we're here for the holiness. And parenthetically, they might say, and yes, we were right, because look at all those people who went out to build those communities far away, and look at all the problems which developed. Look what distance created. They needed money from places, and those places sent them money, but with it came strings, and they were educating them in the wrong way, and so many of them left the way. There were those who were there. There were those who were on the other side who said, we're building this in a secular fashion, any kind of things that they want to do to put in place, religious things, we don't want to have anything to do with it. But there was a significant leadership on both sides and a significant feeling on both sides that, something, this land needs a spirit and it needs a body, it needs both. And maybe some will emphasize the building of one more than the other, Some will take responsibility for the building of one more than the other, but both need to recognize the value of both and to work together for both. And it wasn't just the wild-eyed idealism of Rav Kook that said that this should happen. It was broad. It was broad. Someone like Rav Yosef Chaim included. And just the recognition of what just happened there, that conversation of Rav Charlap. People did things that weren't right. But if through doing something that wasn't right, they become sort of just like written out of the community entirely, then everything goes. If they don't connect to me at all, why should I do anything? And then hostility develops. And we have to recognize that that's the way it works, just like we do with our children. That a single act should not say, okay, so we have no connection to them, and then anything goes. We don't like the act. We don't like where the bima is. We don't like where the earring is. We don't like where the Trumas HaMaisros are or aren't, or what they're teaching in the school, or that they're milking the cows on Shabbos. But look, you're still part of us. You're doing something for the Jewish people. I'm not compromising on what I believe. I'm not joining you in what you're doing, which is a compromise, but I'm valuing what you do, which isn't. This was the tack which they were taking to try to limit the space that existed between, and it would have changed history. And it can still change history, because it's still true. Yes, people are now a couple of generations away from that kind of thing, that kind of observance. But it's still not gone. It's still close. People have to stand for principle. I want to say just one final note for clarity, and it's worthy of a discussion all of its own. People know, they hear this story from 1913. They say, what? Rav Yosef Chaim and Rav Kook went on a trip together for a month. Everybody knows that Rav Yosef Chaim and Rav Kook, there was tremendous tension between their camps, because Rav Kook ended up coming to Yerushalayim. Rav Kook actually left to take this fundraising message and more to Europe for the Knessia Gedola in 1914 of Agudas Yisrael, and he got stuck in Europe for many years because of the war. He was in Switzerland, he was in England, anywhere but in Eretz Yisrael. He came back and he became the Rav of Yerushalayim, which was not accepted by the Eida Charedis. There was tremendous tension. He was the official Rav of Yerushalayim. And Rav Yosef Chaim would refer to him always as the Yafo Rav, the Rav of Yafo. It wasn't because he took his salary. Rav Yosef Chaim never officially accepted a maimed either, a position either. Rav Yosef Chaim, who loved Eretz Yisrael more than anyone, had on his tombstone written 2 words, Ish Yerushalayim. Nothing else. That was the accolade which he wanted. Written, he was a man of Yerushalayim. But they felt that there was a certain benchmark that Yerushalayim was. And Rav Kook, with his beautiful vision of Avas Yisrael and his embracing of everybody, was an extremely important player in the Jewish people. But there also had to be, so to speak, the mezuzah, which was, the purity of the Yishuv of Yerushalayim. Rav Kook and Rav Yosef Chaim, when he went out into the fields, into the Kfarim, right, to show there's a connection, but to come back and to still see that there's a strength and a purity of a position. All of these things are true, and none of them are contradictory. You can recognize the importance of connection as vital, connection between all sides. And you can also respect the integrity of maintaining something of a higher standard a clearer standard that would be able to stand as the model, as the core that would energize the spirit of the Jewish people as well, if it only could all connect with each other. Klal Yisrael today, whether in Eretz Yisrael or outside of Eretz Yisrael, we have these issues all the time. People making choices, contributing many times to the Jewish people. Of course, there are those who just attack the Jewish people, but people who are trying to contribute to the Jewish people, but many times in ways that don't fit or are not always infused by the same value systems that we would hold as sacrosanct, as divine, as Torah min hashamayim. And we have to think and chart our own courses of action to make sure that the breach doesn't widen, that somehow through connection there can be mutual influence without compromise on values which are eternal, but remembering that there's another value, and that value is that all the Jewish people should be together. That's a value too. That's not just a compromise. We should be Zeicha Be'ezus Hashem to see history change.